The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Carl Jung. We live in a culture that subtly, and sometimes overtly, conditions us to justify our every step. Whether it's the career we chose, the person we love, the emotions we feel, or even the silence we need, there's a constant hum in the background. Make it make sense to others. But what happens when your truth doesn't make sense to the people around you? What happens when your becoming contradicts their comfort? This video isn't about communication or clarity. It's about identity. It's about the deep psychological shift that occurs when you stop living to be understood and start existing to be whole. Carl Jung spoke often of individuation, the process of becoming the self that is latent within you. It's not about adding things or copying role models or explaining away your contradictions. It's about stripping away the false layers, many of which were created simply to be palatable. And here's the brutal truth. The more deeply you become yourself, the more misunderstood you might be. And that's not a problem. That's a symptom of your freedom. This is the journey we're taking today. We'll break it down into segments that explore the psychological roots of over-explaining, why it often stems from trauma or early conditioning, how Carl Jung's concept of individuation helps us reclaim the self, and finally, how to stop performing your life and start embodying it. Segment 2. Why over-explaining is a trauma response. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Carl Jung. Have you ever noticed how some people speak in short, unbothered sentences, while others wrap every word in a cushion of justification, disclaimers, and emotional insurance? That second group, they're often not speaking freely. They're managing threats, real or imagined. Over-explaining isn't about being clear. It's about avoiding consequences. It's the child who learned that if they didn't defend themselves in every tiny action, they'd get punished. It's the adult who was once ridiculed for speaking up. So now they lace every opinion with softeners. It's the person who learned early on that being misunderstood was dangerous. According to psychotherapist and writer Pete Walker, one of the most overlooked trauma responses is the fawn response. The fawn type learns to avoid abuse by becoming helpful, pleasing, and overly explanatory, constantly scanning for the emotional state of others and adjusting themselves accordingly. Over time, this creates a compulsive inner narrator who explains everything. Not because you owe others clarity, but because your nervous system is still in a state of hypervigilance. The brain and safety neurologically, this is a function of the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center. When you've experienced relational trauma, especially as a child, your brain becomes wired to prioritize social survival over authenticity. You begin to preemptively justify yourself before someone asks, over-explain even minor actions or preferences, feel guilt or shame when others are confused or don't approve. And this isn't communication, it's emotional camouflage. But here's the shift Jung offers us. True individuation, the becoming of a full self, requires differentiation, not compliance. It requires that we stop explaining ourselves as a method of avoiding rejection and instead tolerate being misunderstood as the price of true wholeness. Segment 3. The persona trap. Why you perform instead of exist. We all have a persona. Jung defined the persona as the mask we wear to interface with the world, a social self created to meet the expectations of culture, family, career, and relationships. It isn't inherently fake or wrong. In fact, it's necessary. We need roles. We need language. We need some form of adaptation. But here's where it becomes dangerous. When you begin to confuse the persona with your actual self, when you mistake the act for your identity, when the mask fits so well, you forget you're wearing it. In childhood, we learn fast. Crying too much gets you shamed, so you smile. Being too curious gets you called annoying, so you stay quiet. Having weird interests gets you mocked, so you become mainstream. And slowly, you start performing. You become the good student, the funny one, the tough guy, the peacemaker, the pretty one, the logical one. Each of these roles are responses to an environment that didn't make space for your full complexity. But here's what happens over time. You become fluent in the language of likability, but illiterate in the language of your soul. The problem, the persona demands explanation. When you live through the persona, you're constantly explaining, defending, clarifying, because you're walking around with a fragile version of yourself. You don't just say, I want this. You say, I want this because I think it makes sense, because it'll benefit you. And I'm sorry if it's selfish. That's the persona talking. It's terrified of rejection. It cannot tolerate conflict. It's designed to adapt, not to own. But the self, as Jung described it, doesn't adapt to be liked. It adapts to be integrated, whole, true, and aligned. And individuation, the lifelong process Jung saw as the goal of psychological development, means slowly shedding the parts of yourself that were built only to survive. When you stop over-explaining, the persona starts to crack. And that's when the real self begins to emerge. The return of the real self and why it terrifies people. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Carl Jung. There's a moment in every person's psychological awakening where something terrifying happens. The real self begins to speak, and it doesn't whisper. It demands. It says things like, I don't want this anymore. I'm exhausted from pretending. I know this isn't who I am. And this is the voice of the self, your integrated psyche rising from beneath the rubble of the persona. But this voice isn't always welcome, not by you, and definitely not by others. The threat of authenticity. But why would your real self terrify people? Because your authenticity becomes a mirror, one that reflects every compromise others are making in their own lives. When you start setting boundaries without justification, when you speak your truth without softening it for comfort, when you pursue a life path that doesn't make sense to others, you start shining a light on their own unlived lives. And nothing is more offensive to the unconscious than someone who lives consciously. Why you might fear it too. It's not just other people who are afraid. You can be afraid too. The real self doesn't come with a script. It doesn't please everyone. It might make you quit a job that kills your spirit. Walk away from a long-term relationship that no longer aligns. Force you to admit that what you've built was based on fear, not desire. This is the existential crisis of individuation. To become who you really are, you might have to eliminate who you've been pretending to be. Jung believed that the self includes both light and dark, what he called the shadow, the parts of you that you've disowned to be socially acceptable. When the real self returns, it brings your desires, your needs, your rage, your grief, and your fire. It's not very clean or polite. It's not optimized for other people's comfort, but it is alive. And when you start living from this space, you stop explaining yourself because you're no longer trying to negotiate your existence. You're finally inhabiting it. How to stop explaining and start embodying. Tools for living unapologetically. You now understand the why over-explaining is a symptom of living in the persona. It's rooted in fear, not truth. It's a way to soften your edges so others won't feel threatened or leave. But knowing that isn't enough. You need to know how to live differently, how to make the shift from a life of justification to a life of embodiment. Here are 5 grounded psychological practices to make that leap. 1. Name the need behind the explanation. When you catch yourself over-explaining, pause and ask, what emotional need am I trying to protect? Usually, it's one of these. The need to be liked. The fear of being misunderstood. The fear of punishment. The fear of abandonment. Once you name the need, you can hold it consciously, instead of acting it out unconsciously. This is Jungian integration, bringing the unconscious into awareness so it no longer controls you from the shadows. 2. Replace explanations with ownership. Don't say, I'm sorry if this is inconvenient, but I just really need some time alone and I hope that's okay. Say, I'm taking time for myself this weekend. It's not cold, it's clean. Ownership silences confusion. The moment you stop giving people a way to argue with your boundaries, your life begins to reflect who you actually are. 3. Practice discomfort tolerance. One of the core muscles of individuation is this. Can you survive being misunderstood without shrinking? People may be confused, disappointed, or even angry when you stop explaining yourself. Let them. When you stop making everyone feel comfortable with your truth, you start becoming powerful inside it. 4. Create environments that reflect yourself, not your persona. Jung believed that external reality reflects inner psychological structures. Look around. Do your friendships require you to perform? Does your job reward you for being small? Do your conversations leave you drained? Start changing your external world to support your internal integrity. That means surrounding yourself with people who don't need you to shrink in order to stay. 5. Journal from the self. Ask yourself in writing, if I didn't care about being understood, what would I do? If I could act without explaining, what would I choose? Where in my life do I still perform? When you write from the self, you start to hear your real voice again. It's quieter than the persona, but much more honest. You are not a concept to be explained. You are a soul to be lived. If you take one truth from this video, let it be this. You're not here to be explained. You're here to be lived. Carl Jung didn't believe in perfection. He believed in wholeness. And wholeness doesn't require an explanation. It requires courage. So the next time you feel that urge to over-explain, pause, take a breath, and choose to exist instead of justify. Before you go, I want to hear from you. Where in your life are you still explaining yourself instead of just being yourself? And a question for you to reflect on. What would your life look like if you no longer needed to be understood? Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.